A Mexican crisis is inevitable. The United Mexican States are but one of only two countries to share a land border with the United States. Naturally, there are many benefits to be drawn from neighboring the global superpower in what has historically been an extremely dynamic economy even in times of isolation. However, unlike Canada, who neighbors the United States to the north, Mexico, as the US's southern neighbor, suffers from terrible instability, extreme crime and poverty, slow development, and more. These conditions have often been chalked up to American exploitation and weakening of Mexico, from the annexation of Texas and what became the American Southwest, to the modern-day attempted hardening of the US-Mexico border. But taking a look back at Mexico's history reveals a very different story. Mexico, or rather New Spain, was an extremely promising colony from its inception. It was rich in silver and exotic goods, had ease of access to both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and was developing at an impressive pace thanks to the trade and investment Spain's empire brought to the region. But Spain also took measures to restrict various aspects of Mexican life and policy so as to preserve stability within the massive territory and to not be surpassed and dominated by its own colony. This was tolerated because the colony, despite these restrictions, remained prosperous as a part of the empire. However, Spain eventually entered into a period of decline upon being outcompeted by rival empires, and consequently, as Spain declined, so did its colonies. Conditions in Mexico grew worse, social unrest rose, criminal and militant forces threatened the citizenry, and ultimately a bloody internal multi-stage war broke out that consumed the country for over a decade, the Mexican War of Independence. Mexico became an unstable independent empire succeeded by an unstable independent republic. In becoming an independent empire, it had removed itself from Spain's network of imperial possessions, significantly weakening its ability to act as a trade empire with direct connections to Europe and Asia. And in becoming a republic, it had lost hold over the Central American lands to the south, which the capital had no real ability to assert its control over. Despite being set back by these losses, Mexico was not necessarily starting from scratch, and could have very well rebounded as a centralized trade hub through proper governance, but such would not be the case. Disputes over whether the new republic should be centralized or decentralized led to political coups, social unrest, militant rebellions from several states, most notably Texas, the Rio Grande, and the Yucatan, which as a consequence triggered the Mexican-American War, costing Mexico several northern territories the capital could not assert control over, before ultimately a bloody internal multi-stage war broke out that consumed the country for what was officially just over 3 years, but in reality spanned 3 decades worth of conflict, the Mexican Civil War, which we might consider beginning with the ousting and execution of President Guerrero, followed by the multiple countrywide rebellions in the years following in response to efforts of centralization, ultimately ending with the Reform War, which returned the liberals to power. As a result of this conflict, Mexico was left economically destitute, unable to repay war debts, and thus France invaded the country immediately following. By the end of the Second French Intervention, Mexico had known only 12 non-consecutive years without a major war since its independence, and the civilian population was continually threatened by marauding groups of bandits and hostile tribes like the Apache, but some lasting peace was finally found upon the ascension of an authoritarian but pragmatic president by the name of Porfirio Diaz. Diaz utilized government power to usher in an era of political and social prosperity and of developmental and economic growth. Industry and agriculture boomed, foreign policy placed the country in a respectable standing, standards of living took off, American investment rose, infrastructure was vastly expanded, the country became further integrated around the capital of Mexico City, and for roughly 4 decades Mexico experienced no major conflicts, leaving this period to sometimes be referred to as the Pax Porfiriana. Diaz created stability, and stability brought confidence in Mexico's future, both from its citizens and from foreign investors, but unfortunately for Mexico, this prosperity would not last. Despite the success of the Diaz regime, it was no secret that such success came at the cost of political suppression and government force. Some began to question what became of Mexico's ideals of freedom and democracy, and so it was determined that with the new century, Mexico, now stabilized, would undertake democratization as its next great challenge. Diaz was challenged politically and lost election to a more liberal candidate, who Diaz proceeded to remove from power by force, only to be removed from power himself in a chaotic chain of events that ultimately caused a bloody internal multi-stage war which consumed the country for nearly a decade or two, the Mexican Revolution. The revolution gave rise to a type of warlordism that called for greater decentralization and redistribution of land in opposition to the new liberal government, which was deemed too moderate and no different from the Diaz establishment. In the end, the liberals overcame the radicals and established a soft authoritarianism through the creation of a one-party system. Like Diaz, the newly formed Institutional Revolutionary Party proceeded to suppress both political and militant rivals who sought decentralization, revolution, or secession. Promotion of rule of law and development of national business and infrastructure was once again taken up, seemingly following in the footsteps of the Diaz slogan of order and progress. For just over 70 years, the PRI would dominate Mexican politics, and as a result, the economy boomed, crime was suppressed, the population rose dramatically, and domestic institutions were fostered and made more closely integrated through protectionist policies. Mexico City's control over surrounding lands was vastly expanded, giving greater strength to the central government and tying the various states of the country closer together, All the while, a closer friendship was built with the United States for the mutual benefit of both parties. However, the public's perception of Mexico's democratic institutions began to fracture, and the face of authoritarianism became more clear to the common citizen, who now questioned what the purpose of the revolution was if all it had done was replace the dictatorship of Diaz with a new dictatorship. Opposition rose against the PRI and it responded by increasing its suppressive actions and adopting more underhanded means of retaining power, including the use of fraud and collaboration with criminal groups. And so civil unrest rose, divides emerged between the previously cooperative intelligentsia of the state and its politicians, the ruling party began to fracture from within, corruption rose by the year, new economic crises were experienced and met with poor policy, conflicts broke out with new militant groups, the ruling party plummeted in popularity, and in a final attempt to alleviate these problems, new measures were taken to promote democratization, ultimately breaking one-party rule by the year 2000. Since then, Mexico has faced a decline in national industry, rising instability, massive emigration to the United States by legal and illegal means, and the explosion of widespread criminal activity across the country, most notably but not exclusively in the form of the cartels, who have locked Mexico in a state of perpetual war that has terrorized citizens and consumed the country for roughly 2 decades. The pattern of Mexican history is very clear: decline, instability, brutal war, authoritarianism, repeat. It very well appears that the country is in the late stages of instability, with a transition to brutal war not far on the horizon, if not already begun. The consequences of this are somewhat predictable as well. Loss of land could very well be expected and is nothing new to Mexico as an entity, as its capital, situated in the rugged Mexican plateau, struggles to exert its dominance over the periphery of its domain, and this has been a leading cause behind desires for decentralization since the very beginning. The states which comprise the country are plainly very different, and geographic divides have naturally given way to significant economic and cultural divides which undermine the authority of the capital. As a result of this inability to effectively govern its widely differing and divergent lands, chaos and conflict have become a staple of Mexican history, and only under the forceful authoritarian rule of Spain, Diaz, and the Institutional Revolutionary Party have peace, progress, and stability been achieved. This brings us to our next point. Mexico very plainly needs extremely firm unidirectional leadership to keep itself united and powerful, whether that be in the form of an imperial monarch, a dictator like Diaz, or a one-party government. The only viable alternatives have been repeatedly made clear by those who have opposed such regimes in the past: decentralization or secession. Regardless of whether or not the state holds together, a return to Mexican authoritarianism will almost certainly follow in response to escalated conflict and economic decline as the public becomes more desperate for solutions to these massive problems facing their country. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.